Bartholomew Town is brought to you in part by the University of Rhode Island Online, Navigant Credit Union, the Audubon Society of Rhode Island, Newport Film, and Half Street Group.
Bartholomew Town.
My name is Chiara Deltito-Sharrott, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Executive Director of the Rhode Island League of Charter Schools. The League is a nonprofit advocacy organization hosted here in Rhode Island, and we work to ensure that every student has access to a high-quality public school education. And the background that I bring to the conversation is really from working at state and local levels of policy, both for the Providence Public School District, the Rhode Island Department of Ed, and now on the nonprofit side. And, the last 13 years of really learning the sector here in Rhode Island, learning about education and how that relates to the national landscape. And I also come to the conversation as a mother of a soon-to-be kindergartner. And the conversation really hits even closer home because of that as well.
Absolutely. And again, thanks so much for your time being here today. So, let's be honest about it. It's a weird moment in American political history, inclusive of the fact that among other discussions that we're hearing is the possibility of the dissolvement of the Department of Education. The fact that we're saying that out loud, and there's some people who would say, well, that's how it needs to be. This is where we need to go. But there's plenty of people who would disagree with that. So but let's get into this conversation. That's kind of the focal point of what we're discussing today. Let's talk about it. I don't even know that people necessarily know the role of the Department of Education. From your experience and from your perspective, what does the Department of Education do from a critical standpoint?
Sure. It's a great question. And it's true that I think most folks don't have a full understanding of what the purpose of the Department of Education is at the federal level. And I would say there's really three main functions of what the Department of Ed does. First, it's funding for states to support schools. Second, looking at protecting the rights of students, especially the most vulnerable populations of students. And then finally, research and evaluation to help us understand where we are as a country with our educational progress. And so when we go back to that funding piece, we're really talking about a number of different things, both competitive grants, but what folks think of, I think, first when they're thinking about aid are the title funds, which are really different types of funding that go to schools for folks like differently abled students, multilingual learners, and students living in poverty. And then, in terms of the protection of student rights, we're talking about everything from the enforcement of federal laws like Title IX and the Americans with Disabilities Act to things that look really practical on the ground, like supporting students with disabilities to ensure that their IEPs, their individual education plans, are met. And then in terms of the evaluation, that really looks pretty broad sweeping and different depending on what lens you're looking at it from. But on some sides, we're talking about competitive grants for different types of research. And on other ends, we're talking about, just evaluating progress, including this national education test, which is called the National I'm blanking. The National Assessment of Educational Progress. Sorry about that.
Oh, I'm also I'm literally trying to pull that up right now as well because it's so excellent.
Yeah. So sorry about that. So the NAEP exam, the National Assessment of Education Progress, which really shows us where we are as a country, state to state, on some standardized measures to help us understand where there are gaps and where we need to invest.
Right. And that's critical information, obviously. It's fundamental. So not having that in place, what would the lack of a centralized national standard of referencing, evaluating, and then being able to create a game plan of sorts for how education needs to move forward in terms of what the strengths are and in terms of what the weaknesses are? If you lose that centralization there from someone in a leadership standpoint such as yours, what does that do to your ability to thoughtfully and effectively inform your own decision making?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely huge. And I first want to start by saying that we don't know exactly what some of these policy changes may result in practice. The idea of getting rid of the NAEP assessment or pulling back on states' requirements for assessment is out there, but it's not predetermined. I think if that were to happen, My biggest concern would be that we would no longer recognize gaps for our highest needs students. And to me, that's the most important part of this assessment of progress. Yes, we do want to know where students are going. We want to know what those trends look like over time so we can see if we're moving forward, stalling, or falling behind. But we also really want to look at critical gaps by different student population to know that we're not just seeing a surface level of performance that's hiding some disparities within it.
Right. A surface level of performance is what you would probably end up with if you didn't have that deep dive. I mean, that's as obvious a statement as you could possibly make, but it's something that people don't think about. And anyone who's an advocate for the dissolvement of the Department of Education ought to take a real thought internally on their own value set about how important it is to dig out specifics when formulating education policy. Let's talk about how this impacts Rhode Island. I feel like we spend so much time lately on how funding streams related to the Washington Bridge or other infrastructure projects are going to upend Rhode Island's ability to grow. We also think about in terms of funding for the blue economy and some of the major projects, the innovation that we're seeing take place in different aspects of that super sector. But what role specifically in Rhode Island does the Department of Education play, and what are the potential impacts, and what about the magnitude of those impacts?
Sure, absolutely. So in terms of the total amount of education funding that goes to schools in our state, the money that comes from the federal government is actually a fairly small percentage. It's about 10 to 12% of the total public education budget. But those dollars are used for really critical things. And if these funds were to be pulled back, there really is the opportunity for every school, every public school in Rhode Island, whether it be a traditional public school, a charter public school, or others, to be affected by the loss of this funding or changes, whatever those may be. And in particular, to give an example, on an annual basis, Rhode Island receives over $100 million for students from low-income households and students with disabilities. And these funds also go to support different pieces like, caring for populations that we care deeply about as a state, such as our multilingual learners, our students with disabilities, children living on military bases, Native American populations in the state, and also for providing really core services to our kids, including high quality before and after care, which has really been something that's been elevated since the pandemic. We also potentially could see changes in funding for workforce development. And really, Rhode Island has led the country in terms of career and technical education, but much of that has been possible through the support of the federal government, both through formula and competitive grants. And that not only affects K-12 education, but it also affects the pipeline of workers, especially those that are, in the 18 to 21-year-old range that are students with disabilities in terms of their planning for the future.
Right.
In addition to all of that, there's also funding that could affect families on the individual basis, such as through Pell Grants and other resources that are given to support kids to go to college. And so Pell Grants originated here in Rhode Island, and they're really a resource based on income that could tip the scale for a family between whether or not they feel comfortable sending their child to college financially. And it could affect also adults that may be thinking that they were in line for public loan forgiveness, and that may be jeopardized at this time as well.
And all of this, I mean, in addition to the protections for vulnerable populations, which are, I don't understand how anybody could look at that and say, yeah, whatever. I mean, it seems so basic that as a society, we ought to be doing this. But even if for some reason someone was to take that position, the workforce development piece that you've just outlined is so critical. And we need to be able to position students and former students in such a way that from the skill set that they have, be it technologies they learn, critical thinking, all of the baseline educational reading, writing, arithmetic, where's Cotton Mather while we're at it here? Like the baseline level of things needs to be positioned in tandem with an environment that allows for workforce development and inclusive of the fact that whether it's student loan forgiveness or opportunities to pursue higher ed through Pell Grants or other programs, if you don't have that in place in a meaningful way, in a centralized way as well, that's consistent from state to state, at least in practice and in theory, I mean, what are we doing here? You're just going to have a almost like an anarcho workforce development environment that you'll get some good outcomes here and there, but you're also going to see some either bad outcomes or no outcomes at all. Your take on that?
I think that's absolutely true. And I think families across the country are feeling the same. The National Parents Union did a survey and they found that almost 70% of families were really in support of the federal government holding schools accountable for this very reason, because they know that these priorities around workforce development, around college going, et cetera, care for our highest needs students are things that benefit from oversight by the federal government.
Yeah, it's a fine line too. From someone who's in an administrative position such as yours, how much, having said all of what you just outlined and we've been kind of building on, how important is it that individual districts, individual states, individual aspects of states, such as the League of Charters and such as, any superintendent of a large district, all of those different levels, how important is it to have autonomy as well? Because it is true that what takes place in Rhode Island is going to be different than what takes place in, say, Mississippi in terms of educational needs. And obviously we start to see local control in places like Oklahoma where they want to put Bibles in the classrooms. I don't think you'd get that here, maybe in some places, but for the most part, you wouldn't see other than a Catholic school, you wouldn't see an appetite for that. How important is it to have that ability to have local control married with a centralized federal plan?
I think it's incredibly important. And as charter public schools, this was really the impetus about the start of the movement in the first place, was to give more decision-making power to families, students, and those closest to the ground. But at the same time, we have to keep in mind that states already have the majority of the discretion over decision-making for education. And what we're really talking about here is how the federal government either incentivizes or supports leaning in certain areas and measuring progress towards them. And so I don't imagine that significant latitude will be lost or even given back based on these changes. However, I do think that when it comes to protections for students, the emphasis which a state places on support for our highest need kids could be jeopardized based on the federal government not being there to put in place the enforcement of things like the Americans with Disabilities Act, Title IX, et cetera. In Rhode Island, we're incredibly, lucky to have an administration that I think prioritizes the right things in terms of those student rights and supports. But that may not be true everywhere across the country. And also administrations change over time. And so, what we see now, what may not be the same as what we see in the future. I think for those reasons, it's super important that all of our superintendents, whether they be at a charter public school, LEA, a local education agency, or at a traditional public school district, be mindful of what these changes might look like, be thoughtful about what their strategies are, but it can't hurt to have the federal government holding in line what those goalposts are around, critical supports for high needs student populations.
Absolutely, 100% agree. You get on an elevator when you leave where you are right now, or you get into the stairs, and somehow, some way, there's Donald Trump there, along with Linda McMahon. I mean, this seems like we could be talking about Survivor Series WWF 1999 here, but unfortunately, those are, well, I'll leave it at that. You bump into them on the elevator. You've got 30 seconds to make a pitch. What do you say?
Yeah, I think I would say, as a representative of the state of Rhode Island's public school system, and specifically our charter public schools, we appreciate the ideas around flexibility and autonomy, but we believe that that has to be enforced with clear boundaries and supports for high need populations and in general all students. And so, we want to see how these policies play out in the spirit of supporting all children and making sure that their needs are met, both in terms of that funding piece and also, the right to access to high quality education.
And kind of lastly here, just sort of wrapping on a riff of sorts, to parents out there, students out there, to members of the community out there who are nervous about this right now. If in fact this does go through and it is somehow upheld in court, again, it seems like this will not likely go all the way through. But again, I never thought I'd wake up in the morning and see that the Gulf of America or Gulf of Mexico is now the Gulf of America. So, and that's obviously a important but superficial example as compared to what we're discussing today. But for people in the community right now who are concerned about this major shift in attitude and major shift in direction, at least in terms of a goal from the current administration, what can you say to them about how you've been able to, or how you and other educational leaders in the state of Rhode Island can stabilize education writ large in the wake of these challenging moments?
Yeah, I think that's the question of the hour for sure. One thing for me is just starting with any folks that I'm having this conversation with to say, we really don't know what this is going to look like or what the shades of gray look like, right? And so we've heard folks talk about dismantling the Department of Education, but what does that actually look like in practice? Is that all functions? Is that sending more money to the state to have discretion over? Is that putting impetus on the states to do things without giving them any resources or perhaps taking those resources away? And so there's a lot still to figure out there. I think in practice, though, what we can do is stay mindful and aware of what's going on at the federal level, but really more than that, stay committed to our values and our practices at the state level, at the school level, and double down on those however we can. And so we have been lucky to live in a state where our administration has been doing just that. We saw some recent responses in the media from our Commissioner of Education and others speaking to upholding the values and the policies that we have as a state. And we also have an opportunity as a state in thinking through, do we look at our funding formula again for schools? Do we look at critical ways that we're sharing resources to say if something major changes and distribution needs to be changed to support high needs students, how might we be able to create some of those protections at the local level? And what might it mean to shift our priorities slightly to be able to do that? And I think, the League is very committed to doing that in partnership with our traditional public school allies, nonprofits, and others who are really just trying to do what's best for kids.
And I guess sort of bonus last question, if you don't mind. I think a lot of people would worry about cuts. We've seen threats of cuts to sports programs, for example, in Providence schools, as there's been budgetary challenges of an enormous nature there, incomparable and unique as compared with the discussion we're having today. But nonetheless, one of the things that we've seen over the course of time in education is rolling back of programs, particularly those tied to the arts, particularly those tied to critical thinking, and we're starting to see more and more flavor around athletics. And the next step, of course, is cuts within the school, teachers becoming part-time teachers that were once full-time, facilities not getting the upgrades they need. And I don't mean the general infrastructure, which is bonded. I'm talking about pens and pencils level of facilities and infrastructure upgrades. When does that start?
It's unclear, but I would say that if these critical supports for students with disabilities, for multilingual learners, for students living in poverty do receive cuts, of course, money's going to have to be redistributed to go to those essential practices before we're looking at the additional infrastructure. And many people, myself included, would argue that things like the arts, sports, et cetera, have high importance up there with those traditionally academic components. But at the end of the day, our school's first responsibility is to make sure that students can read, write, and thrive in their future. And so I think we're going to have to see some resources redistributed towards those essential services first, or towards teaching and learning. And, we see this in real time in Rhode Island, even before any of these cuts are made for our charter public schools, because we do receive, about $3,000 less per student than our traditional public school partners do. And that does have impacts for our facilities, for what we can pay teachers, and other kind of critical infrastructure pieces. The way that we've handled that as charter public schools is to think really creatively about partnering with nonprofit organizations. And I'm really interested to see how philanthropy responds in this case. It may not be directly to public institutions, but even if it's to nonprofit partners, how do we think more from an ecosystem perspective to take some of the kind of tremendous burden that schools have to do everything for students and families, to allow them to focus on that core instruction and partner with those in the community that really do that out of school time, sports, whatever it may be, well, to ensure that students are still getting access to those resources.
Thanks so much for your time today. Super informative, great discussion. Thanks for your work in general.
Thank you so much.
Hey, thanks for stopping by Bartholomew Town. For more content, follow me on Instagram @Bill Bartholomew.